So, you sent over some really interesting material this time. Excerpts from the Next Millionaire Next Door.
Yeah.
It really gets you thinking,
Yeah.
Like, has the path to becoming a millionaire really changed all that much over the last couple of decades?
Right.
It seems like you're trying to figure out, like, what are those truly lasting strategies that still work and, how those apply to, like, today's world.
Huh.
So that's what we're going to dive into right now.
Yeah. And what's so fascinating about this book is, it's trying to like bust those myths that we have about, wealthy people.
Mm-hmm.
And instead it's like focusing on the real behaviors and habits of, people who have actually built wealth, sometimes like quietly over time.
Right.
And I think what we're going to unpack for you is how the insights from that original Millionaire Next Door book, which came out way back in 1996,
Wow, yeah.
stack up against the more recent data, which they collected, all the way up to 2016.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Because, like, one thing that really jumps out at you is that despite all the massive changes we've seen, technology just exploding, the economy going through all these, like, twists and turns.
Right.
The fundamental principles of becoming what they call a millionaire next door seem to have stayed, like, surprisingly consistent.
Yeah, that's a key takeaway. I mean, you might assume that with the internet age, social media, constantly in our faces and, this globalized economy, that the rules of the game have been completely rewritten.
Right.
But what the research really suggests is that there's like a much deeper set of principles.
Okay.
A much more kind of enduring set of principles at play when it comes to building wealth.
So let's dig into one of those seemingly, like, timeless principles, the whole power of frugality.
Absolutely. At its core, it really boils down to that very straightforward idea of consistently living below your means.
Mm-hmm.
And, the authors, they really emphasize that this basic equation, this idea of spending less than you earn, is something that always holds true.
Okay.
Regardless of what's happening in the economy.
Yeah.
The latest political, winds are
Right.
societal trends. It's just fundamental math.
Yeah. But it's interesting, though, when you think about now, right, with social media constantly showcasing, like, these curated lifestyles and, this, like, urge to trade up and acquire more.
Yeah.
It feels even stronger now than maybe it did back in the late 90s and early 2000s when that first book came out.
That's a really insightful point because, these distractions, whether it was the allure of the dot-com boom back then, or like you said, the carefully constructed realities that we see on social media now,
right,
they tend to pull people away from, that central principle of saving diligently.
Mm-hmm.
And, when you factor in things like the rising costs of, healthcare and education, that gap between, earning and spending, it becomes even more crucial to manage.
Now, there have been some critics who argue that this whole idea of the millionaire next door might be a little outdated, that maybe the internet boom created this really unique set of circumstances, and perhaps we're only looking at the success stories, which, what they call survivorship bias. What's the response to that?
Well, what's interesting is that the more recent research really does offer a compelling kind of counter-argument.
Okay.
It strongly suggests that those core behaviors that lead to wealth accumulation haven't actually changed in any fundamental way.
Okay.
They're not dependent on, these kind of fleeting societal or technological shifts.
Interesting.
In fact, the data even shows that within, non-affluent populations, the same characteristics that we see in millionaires tend to distinguish those individuals who are more effective at building wealth relative to their income. So it's not just about a specific era or a lucky few.
So it really underscores that these aren't just like flukes or exceptions.
Exactly. And, if we connect this to the bigger picture, we see these modern examples of this enduring frugality.
Okay.
In movements like the FIRE movement. So that's financial independence, retire early.
Gotcha.
Think about figures like Mr. Money Mustache and that whole community.
Right.
There are like literally thousands of blogs about this.
Wow.
And their whole philosophy is built on the idea of, very aggressively maximizing your savings and drastically minimizing your expenses to achieve this financial freedom as quickly as possible. It's the principle of living below your means really amplified.
And it strikes me that a lot of people in that community actually cite the millionaire next door as a key influence.
They do. I mean, it's almost like it's seen as this foundational text for that particular mindset. And I think it's really important to note, this isn't just a movement for people with ultra high incomes.
Right.
You see individuals at all different income levels adopting these principles and making it work.
So it really boils down to like deliberate choices.
It does.
And you mentioned a specific example, the Jacobsons.
Yeah, the Jacobsons. On the surface, they just seem like a very typical couple, both with advanced degrees in chemical engineering. Oh. They lived in the same modest home for, like 20 years, diligently saving and investing, raising a family. Mm. And they managed to do this, primarily on a single income for a significant chunk of that time. They didn't hit the jackpot. Right. They didn't, launch some groundbreaking tech company. Right. Their wealth was a result of literally decades of consistent, perhaps seemingly, small financial decisions. So it's a very classic millionaire next door story playing out in modern times.
So this idea of, consistently spending less than you earn. Yeah. It sounds so simple.
It does.
But it clearly has this really profound effect over time. Now, let's kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about something that often gets confused with wealth. Income.
This is a really critical distinction to make.
Okay.
Wealth, at least in the way that we're talking about it, is really about your net worth.
Okay.
So it's what you own minus what you borrow.
Okay.
Income, on the other hand, is simply the money that you earn.
Right.
Unfortunately, the media often uses these terms interchangeably, and this can create a really misleading picture.
Right.
Just because someone has a large paycheck, it doesn't automatically mean that they're building, true lasting wealth.
Right. You can be bringing in a lot of money, but if you're spending it just as quickly, you're not really building up that financial safety net.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
While the research indicates that, the vast majority of millionaires and high net worth individuals are economically productive, they're doing this through their own work and efforts.
Right.
That high income on its own is absolutely no guarantee of significant wealth accumulation.
So, like, in terms of sheer numbers, how much growth have we seen in millionaire households in the U.S. over the past couple of decades?
Well, the figures are pretty revealing. Back in 1996, there were approximately 3.5 million millionaire households in the United States.
Okay.
And that represented about 3.5% of all households.
Gotcha.
Fast forward to 2017, and that number had grown significantly to around 11.5 million households.
Wow.
Or about 9% of all U.S. households.
That's huge.
Yeah.
But what about how that wealth is distributed? Has that changed much during that same period?
If we kind of zoom out and look at the bigger picture of wealth distribution, it remains, quite concentrated.
Okay.
In 2016, the top 10% of households held almost 76%.
Wow.
Of the total $84.9 trillion in personal wealth in the U.S.
Okay.
And what's interesting is that this level of concentration is quite similar to what was observed back in 1996.
Gotcha.
So while we've seen more people becoming millionaires, the overall kind of distribution of wealth hasn't drastically shifted.
So the pie has gotten bigger.
Yeah.
But those biggest slices are still held by like a relatively small percentage. That's important context, I think.
Yeah.
Now, thinking about the millionaires of today, like, what does their lifestyle actually look like? Are they all living these like super extravagant lives that we, see in movies and on TV?
Well, the reality, and this is something that the research consistently highlights, is generally quite different. The vast majority of today's millionaires, so like 80% of those who are not yet retired, they typically work around, 45 hours a week.
Gotcha.
And they do this in a really diverse range of professions. They're business owners, they're attorneys, engineers, doctors, and so on. And what's also striking is that over 86% of them reported having no income from trusts or estates in the previous year.
Wow.
So this really underscores the fact that they've largely built their wealth through their own efforts and hard work.
Okay. And what about those common assumptions? Like, are they all incredibly stressed, don't get enough sleep, things like that?
Well, it's interesting to look at the data on that. Nearly 90% of these millionaires report being, generally satisfied with their lives. Almost 80% describe their physical health as good or excellent.
Wow.
And on average, they get, a pretty healthy 7.65 hours of sleep per night.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. So it doesn't exactly fit that stereotype of the constantly, stressed, sleep-deprived tycoon that we often see portrayed.
Right. It's a much more balanced, a surprisingly like normal picture, I guess.
Yeah.
And it seems to tie back to that, that core principle of frugality, right?
It really does. Frugality and careful budgeting are central to their lifestyle. 70% of these millionaires report knowing exactly how much they spend on essential items each year.
Okay.
And almost 60% say they've always considered themselves to be frugal. And furthermore, over 60% believe that their frugality has been critical to their overall success.
So can you give me like some specific concrete examples of this frugality in action?
Sure. When they were asked about the most they've ever spent on certain everyday items, the average response was around $50 for a pair of jeans, about $150 for sunglasses, and roughly $300 for a watch.
Gotcha.
And, they're not chasing after, like, fleeting sales or trends. In fact, around 77% of them haven't even stepped foot in a store on Black Friday in the last 5 years.
That really contrasts with those images we always see.
It does.
And what about cars? Because that's another one where we think, wealthy people splurge on expensive luxury vehicles.
Once again, the reality tends to be much more grounded in practicality and value. They typically drive reliable, non-luxury brands like Toyota, Honda, or Ford.
Okay.
Their vehicles are often at least 3 years old.
Okay.
The average price they paid for their most recent car was around $35,000. And the most they've ever spent on a vehicle in their lifetime is typically around $40,000. So it really challenges those stereotypical images we have about, the cars that millionaires drive.
Yeah, the frugality in car choices is interesting because it seems to highlight this key thing, that they prioritize utility and value over status signaling.
Absolutely.
And that might be like a mindset shift a lot of people need to make.
Yeah, I think so.
Now let's move on to another really pervasive myth. The idea that most millionaires, they just inherited their money.
Right.
You hear all the time they were just born into wealth.
This is a myth that just won't die.
Yeah.
And it's one that the research consistently debunks, the finding that something like 80 to 86% of millionaires are self-made.
Okay.
And by self-made, we mean they accumulated their wealth through their own efforts.
Right.
This finding has remained remarkably consistent over time. And if we look at the trend among the wealthiest individuals in America, that percentage of self-made wealth has actually increased a lot over the decades. For example, Forbes reported that back in 1982, only about 38% of America's wealthiest were considered self-made.
Yeah.
But by 2012, that figure had jumped to a pretty impressive 70%.
Wow.
So the trend is actually moving towards more wealth being self-generated.
So that's a big shift. So where do these self-made millionaires typically come from then? Like what kind of backgrounds did they have?
Well, the research from the book Stop Acting Rich gives us some interesting insights into this.
Okay.
They were looking at data from, like the mid-2000s.
Okay.
And about 24% of these self-made millionaires reported that their fathers were in blue-collar jobs.
Wow.
Which is actually the single largest occupational category.
Okay.
Another 19% had fathers who were small business owners. In contrast, only a relatively small percentage had fathers who were like, senior corporate executives, physicians, things like that.
Right.
Interestingly, a large chunk of these millionaires, their parents didn't even go to college.
Wow.
And many of these millionaires had to pay for their own higher education.
Okay.
And a lot of them reported starting their working lives with a net worth of 0 or even less.
Wow.
And they received very little in terms of inheritance.
So it really highlights that for the majority of them, it's really about their own, decisions and hard work and efforts rather than just being handed this wealth.
Absolutely. And if we think about this, in the context of this broader discussion around socioeconomic mobility in America, it's worth noting that some research suggests that upward mobility hasn't declined as much as some media narratives might lead us to believe. Okay. And I think this underlying belief that one can achieve success and that these economic opportunities exist, that seems to be a really crucial factor for those who ultimately do end up building wealth.
So that mindset piece is really crucial.
Yeah.
So let's dig into some of those key behaviors and mindsets that seem to contribute to this process of, actually building wealth.
So one of the really foundational elements here is having a clear awareness of your own abilities, skills and competencies, and then being able to understand how those can be applied in the marketplace to create a successful career or business.
Yeah.
It's also about having a certain degree of foresight, like being able to spot, emerging trends, growing needs in your community or your industry, and then aligning, your services or your products accordingly.
And that underlying belief that you actually can become wealthy seems to be a really significant factor as well.
Totally. The authors share this compelling story about someone they call Britt.
Okay.
Who was previously, very much a part of that, income statement of affluent group, heavily focused on spending.
Gotcha.
But once Britt really consciously shifted their focus and applied the same determination that they had used to pay off debt towards saving and investing, at least 15% of their income. Wow. Their entire financial trajectory changed. That belief in the possibility that they could actually build wealth acts as a very powerful motivator.
And it really challenges that myth that we talked about earlier, that you can judge someone's wealth by just looking at their car or the clothes they wear.
Exactly. That's a dangerous and often totally inaccurate way of thinking about wealth. And the book introduces this idea of a Ranger X rich as like a caricature of someone who buys into these superficial myths, focusing on projecting an image of wealth, through conspicuous concession, but not actually having that underlying, really strong financial foundation.
Right. It's interesting to think about taxes, too. You often hear about discussions of whether the wealthy are paying their fair share.
Yeah.
What does the research have to say about that?
Well, the book kind of gives us a slightly different perspective on this. They found that the typical millionaire next door pays the equivalent of about 2% of their net worth in income tax each year.
Okay.
Now, if we contrast this with someone like Warren Buffett, whose tax rate as a percentage of his wealth is notoriously, much lower, it's around like 0.015%.
Wow.
The difference is pretty stark, but I think it's important to understand that broader context here, which often includes, really significant charitable giving that reduces taxable income for people like Buffett.
So it really highlights the complexity, I guess, of that issue. What about other character traits? Do things like honesty and integrity play a role in, building wealth over long term?
Absolutely. Well, popular culture sometimes portrays this stereotype of the evil rich.
Yeah.
The data actually suggests that the personality factor of conscientiousness, which includes traits like integrity and responsibility, is an important predictor of long-term financial success.
Okay.
They share this really nice anecdote about Dr. Lawrence, who's an optometrist, he's a millionaire, who built this thriving practice by consistently putting his customers' needs first and really operating with integrity. It's a nice illustration of that principle.
And it's not always about, these public displays of wealth or recognition, is it?
Not at all. In fact, they share this really touching story about a couple who've chosen to remain anonymous. But they quietly donate very significant portions of their wealth to various causes. It highlights that for many wealthy individuals, the motivation behind their financial success isn't about, public acclaim or recognition. It's often rooted in a very genuine desire to help others.
That's interesting. You also talked about this idea of hyperconsumption as a barrier to actually building wealth.
Right.
Can you elaborate on that a bit?
So hyperconsumption is that constant, often impulsive urge to spend money, to acquire more and more stuff. This behavior directly and significantly hinders the process of wealth accumulation. The researchers contrast this with what they call prodigious accumulators of wealth, or PAWs, who are incredibly skilled at transforming their income into net worth. And what's really interesting is that PAWs tend to report higher levels of life satisfaction and significantly less worry about, achieving financial independence and a comfortable retirement.
Interesting.
Compared to those who consistently underaccumulate wealth, even though they might have similar income levels.
It shows that it's not just about how much you make, but what you do with it.
It really is.
Now, early financial lessons in the overall environment we grew up in, they seem to have a really lasting impact.
They really do. I mean, think about it. Our upbringing, the financial habits that are modeled by our families, they have a huge influence on how we approach saving and spending throughout our lives. And the research shows this pretty clear correlation between how frugal parents are and the subsequent net worth of their children.
Wow.
Yeah. It suggests that this respect for money, which is often fostered through budgeting and planning, that this is often passed down through generations. And it almost acts like a magnet for wealth accumulation.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. And, the example they give of Christy, who attributes her financial success to her parents being really open about money and their, consistent budgeting practices.
Right.
I think it really illustrates that nicely.
So even if someone didn't necessarily grow up in like a financially savvy household, can they still like change those patterns and actually build wealth?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
While those early experiences definitely have an influence.
The good news is that, making deliberate behavioral changes can absolutely lead to financial success.
Okay.
Even if those early experiences were, challenging.
Gotcha.
The book shares all these inspiring stories of people who consciously went in a different direction than their spendthrift parents.
Okay.
Or who learned really valuable lessons by witnessing their parents' financial struggles firsthand.
Right.
The story of Mrs. H, who was raised by a very frugal, immigrant single mother who consistently reinvested her savings into building a family business, is just this amazing illustration that a perceived lack of wealth during your childhood doesn't mean that you can't achieve significant financial success later on.
That's a hopeful message.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about the role that marriage and, your choice of partner can have in all of this.
Marriage, and this might be surprising to some people, has a really big influence on long-term financial success.
Research consistently shows that a very high percentage of millionaires, around 93% in their surveys, are either married or have remarried.
Gotcha.
And over 80% of them say that their spouse has been a really key factor in their economic achievements.
Wow.
Studies have also found that married couples tend to accumulate significantly more wealth than single individuals.
Wow.
And conversely, divorce can have a huge negative financial impact.
So choosing a life partner is also kind of like making a really big financial decision in a way.
In a very real sense, yes. The qualities that millionaires report valuing most in a spouse often include things like honesty, responsibility, love, capability, and a supportive nature. And they share a great example about a wife who really encouraged her husband to go back to college and pursue a more fulfilling and ultimately financially rewarding career path.
Yeah.
And I think that illustrates that really supportive dynamic. On the other hand, they tell the story of Henry, who made this difficult decision to break off an engagement.
Oh, wow. Because of his fiance's consistently irresponsible, credit habits.
Oh, wow.
And this really shows how fundamentally different approaches to finances can be a major source of conflict and a potential obstacle to building that shared wealth.
And all of this seems to tie into this idea of not being overly concerned with what other people think about your spending.
This idea of social indifference.
Okay.
Essentially like ignoring what your neighbors are driving, what they're wearing, and not being overly influenced by these external displays of wealth.
Okay.
This is a really key trait among wealth builders. It helps them to avoid that trap of conspicuous consumption.
Right.
And the pressure to keep up with the Joneses. And what's interesting is that this ability to be indifferent to those social trends and norms regarding spending is actually a really strong predictor of net worth.
Wow.
Regardless of things like your age, your income level, or even how much inheritance you received.
So in a way, keeping your success a bit private
can actually help you build more of it.
It can. A lot of millionaires next door, they just don't feel this need to show off their wealth.
Right.
Through all these luxury goods and status symbols. They often find that the achievement of financial independence itself is a much greater reward than any material possession could ever provide. And this really contrasts with those that the book calls the income statement affluent, who tend to spend a lot to project this image of wealth. And they often get caught in what the authors call the hyperspending treadmill. And there's often a real kind of disdain among those who are financially savvy for that wasteful spending and the perceived need to constantly prove your status.
And then you think about marketing and the power of big data.
Oh, yeah.
They're so good at driving our spending.
Absolutely. Marketers have incredibly sophisticated tools at their disposal these days to understand our behaviors, to tailor products and services to our preferences. It's really amazing. But the millionaires next door, much like their counterparts from, decades ago, tend to largely ignore this kind of hype and noise. They stay focused on their long-term financial goals.
And, even the idea of frugality itself can sometimes be like a trend or a fashion.
It can. The fashion of frugality, it ebbs and flows with these broader economic changes and societal trends. But what's much more important for long-term sustainable wealth building is, a consistent and disciplined practice of sound spending habits, rather than just adopting this frugal persona, because it happens to be the in thing at the moment.
Right. Okay, so to kind of summarize some of these key traits, what really stands out?
So we see a lot of recurring characteristics. Consistently living below their means. This is absolutely paramount. As is this general satisfaction with their financial situation. They often donate to charitable causes. They tend to hold more conservative political views. They've typically received very little inheritance. They often have a similarly frugal spouse as a key partner in their financial journey. And consistent long-term investing is a deeply ingrained habit. And it's worth reiterating that concept of relative net worth. How effectively you're transforming your income into net worth compared to your peers. That seems to be even more closely linked to happiness and well-being than the actual number of your net worth.
Interesting. And I think when we talk about this idea of frugality, it's really important to understand that it's not about like deprivation or going without. It's more about making like conscious, deliberate choices.
That's a good way to put it. Frugal individuals tend to lead a very simple and economical lifestyle, and they spend significantly less than they earn. It takes, a certain degree of discipline and that social indifference we